Country music has always celebrated honesty, humility, and small town value. But behind the hit songs, standing ovations, and legendary careers, some of its biggest stars left behind a very different reputation. Fellow musicians, band members, producers, and even close friends often told stories that fans rarely heard. In this video, we'll look at 12 country stars whose behavior offstage shocked the people around them. Some were reckless, and a few were nearly impossible to work with. Dung, nếu theo danh sách bạn đã chốt, thì nhân vật đầu tiên phải là George Jones, không phải Billy Joe Shaver. 1. George Glenn Jones. Few artists in country music history are as beloved as George Jones, known as the Possum. He possessed one of the greatest voices the genre has ever heard. Songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today made him a legend, and many country singers still consider him the finest vocalist of all time. To fans, Jones represented traditional country music at its purest. But behind the unforgettable voice was a man whose behavior often drove friends, band members, promoters, and even family members to the edge of their patience. At the height of his fame, George Jones became almost as famous for missing concerts as he was for recording hit songs. His severe struggles with alcohol and drug addiction made him wildly unpredictable. Promoters never knew whether he would actually show up for a scheduled performance. Many paid thousands of dollars to book him, only to discover at the last minute that Jones was nowhere to be found. His repeated absences became so common that he earned an infamous nickname throughout the industry, No-Show Jones. The damage extended far beyond disappointed fans. Band members depended on those performances for their income, and many became frustrated by the constant uncertainty. Musicians would travel hundreds of miles, prepare for a show, and wait backstage only to learn that Jones would not appear. Some colleagues admired his talent so deeply that they tolerated the chaos, but others eventually walked away. Several people who worked closely with him later admitted that his addictions made him one of the most difficult stars in country music to depend on professionally. His personal relationships suffered just as much. Jones's marriage to fellow country superstar Tammy Wynette became legendary for its volatility. Their relationship was marked by frequent arguments, separations, and dramatic incidents fueled by his drinking. One of the most famous stories involved Jones reportedly driving a riding lawnmower several miles to a liquor store after Wynette hid the keys to his car. While fans often laugh at the story today, people close to the couple saw it as evidence of how deeply addiction had taken control of his life. What made George Jones especially frustrating to those around him was the fact that everyone knew how extraordinary he could be when he was focused. Fellow artists often said there was no one better on stage. When sober and committed, he delivered performances that left audiences speechless. Yet the same man could also create chaos that affected dozens of people at a time. His immense talent and self-destructive behavior existed side by side for decades. In later years, Jones worked hard to rebuild both his career and his reputation. He openly acknowledged many of his mistakes and eventually regained the respect of much of the industry. Even so, the stories from his wild years remain a major part of his legacy. George Jones was not disliked because of a lack of talent. He was difficult because his addictions and unpredictability often turned admiration into frustration for the very people who wanted him to succeed the most. 2. David Allan Coe. Few figures in country music have generated as much controversy as David Allan Coe. To his loyal fans, he was the ultimate outlaw, an artist who refused to follow Nashville's rules and spoke his mind no matter the consequences. His songwriting talent was undeniable, and songs such as You Never Even Called Me By My Name earned him a permanent place in country music history. But behind the rebellious image was a man whose behavior and public persona often alienated fellow musicians, industry executives, and even many country fans. From the beginning of his career, Coe cultivated an image built on defiance. He frequently presented himself as an outsider who stood against the music establishment. While that attitude attracted a devoted following, it also created countless conflicts. Promoters, journalists, and record executives often described him as difficult to predict and even harder to manage. Unlike many artists who carefully protected their public image, Coe seemed to embrace controversy whenever it appeared. Part of the problem was that Coe often blurred the line between publicity and personal belief. Over the years, he made statements and released material that generated criticism across the country music community. Some fellow artists felt he intentionally provoked outrage simply to gain attention. Others believed he genuinely enjoyed challenging social norms regardless of the damage it caused to his reputation. Either way, the result was the same. Many people in the industry became reluctant to associate themselves with him. His relationships with other musicians could be equally complicated. Coe developed a reputation for feuds, confrontations, and sharp opinions about fellow performers. While some artists respected his honesty, others viewed him as unnecessarily combative. Stories circulated about tense encounters backstage, disagreements during tours, and arguments that quickly escalated. The outlaw image that made him appealing to fans often made him exhausting for colleagues who simply wanted a professional working relationship. One reason Coe remains such a polarizing figure is that his talent was never seriously questioned. Even many critics acknowledged his songwriting ability. Several country stars recorded his songs, and his influence on outlaw country remains significant. Yet many people struggled to separate the artist from the controversy that constantly surrounded him. His reputation became less about his music and more about the conflicts, headlines, and arguments that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Unlike some country stars whose difficult behavior stemmed from addiction or personal tragedy, Coe often appeared to thrive on confrontation itself. He seemed comfortable standing apart from the crowd, even if it meant creating enemies along the way. That independence earned him admiration from some and resentment from others. In the end, David Allan Coe became one of country music's most divisive personalities. He built a career on refusing to compromise, and while that approach helped create his legend, it also left behind a trail of damaged relationships and controversy. For many fans, he was a fearless truth-teller. For many who had to work with him, he was one of the most difficult personalities the genre had ever seen. 3. Donald Eugene Lytle, Johnny Paycheck. Johnny Paycheck built his career on rebellion. With his hard-living image, rough voice, and anti-authority attitude, he became one of the defining figures of outlaw country music. His biggest hit, Take This Job and Shove It, turned him into a working-class hero and a symbol of resistance against the establishment. Fans loved him because he seemed fearless, unpredictable, and unapologetically authentic. But behind the image that sold millions of records was a man whose behavior often created problems for nearly everyone around him. Long before he became famous, Paycheck had already developed a reputation for trouble. He was known for drinking heavily, getting into fights, and clashing with authority figures. As his career grew, those tendencies only became more visible. Promoters often worried about his reliability, while fellow musicians sometimes found themselves caught in the middle of his personal battles. Stories of arguments, confrontations, and reckless decisions followed him throughout much of his professional life. Unlike some country stars who managed to keep their personal struggles hidden from the public, Paycheck's problems frequently became front-page news. His unpredictable behavior made him difficult to manage, and his temper often led to confrontations that damaged relationships within the industry. Band members and associates occasionally described him as someone who could be charming and generous one moment, then explosive and hostile the next. This inconsistency made working with him a constant gamble. The most damaging chapter of his life came in the 1980s when a confrontation at a bar led to a shooting incident. Paycheck was convicted and eventually served time in prison. The event shocked country music fans and severely damaged his reputation. For many people in the industry, it confirmed fears that his reckless behavior had finally spiraled out of control. While some supporters remained loyal, others began distancing themselves from him, concerned that his personal troubles had become impossible to separate from his public image. Yet what made Johnny Paycheck such a complicated figure was that his talent remained undeniable. He possessed a unique voice capable of delivering heartbreak, anger, and vulnerability with equal power. Fellow musicians often admired his musical abilities even when they struggled to tolerate his behavior. Some believed that beneath the tough exterior was a deeply troubled man, fighting personal demons he could never fully overcome. As the years passed, health problems and legal troubles took their toll. His career never completely recovered from the damage caused by his actions, and the rebellious image that once made him famous gradually became a burden. What had seemed exciting and dangerous during his rise to stardom eventually contributed to his downfall. Today, Johnny Paycheck remains one of country music's most controversial figures. His story is a reminder that talent alone is not always enough to sustain a career. While fans remember the hit songs and outlaw attitude, many people who worked with him remember something else. A gifted artist whose unpredictable temper and self-destructive choices often made him one of the most difficult men in country music. 4. Hiram King Williams, Hank Williams. Hank Williams is often regarded as the greatest songwriter in country music history. More than 70 years after his death, his songs continue to influence artists across multiple generations. Classics like Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, and Cold, Cold Heart helped define the sound of modern country music. To millions of fans, Hank Williams remains a legendary figure whose music captured heartbreak better than anyone before or since. Yet behind the brilliance was a deeply troubled man whose behavior increasingly frustrated the people who depended on him. Williams' rise to fame was remarkably fast. By his mid-20s, he was already one of the biggest stars in America. However, fame arrived alongside serious personal struggles. He suffered from chronic pain caused by a spinal condition, and over time, he relied heavily on alcohol and prescription medications. These addictions began affecting every aspect of his life, including his relationships with band members, business partners, and concert promoters. As his substance abuse worsened, Hank became increasingly unreliable. Performances were frequently disrupted by intoxication, and some shows ended in embarrassment when he could no longer perform properly. Promoters who paid significant sums to book him never knew which version of Hank Williams would arrive. Sometimes he delivered unforgettable performances that left audiences amazed. Other times, he appeared late, intoxicated, or unable to complete the show. This unpredictability made him one of the most difficult stars in country music to manage despite his enormous popularity. His professional relationships suffered as a result. Members of his band, the Drifting Cowboys, often found themselves trying to cover for his mistakes. Friends and colleagues watched helplessly as his addictions gained control over his life. Many cared deeply about him and wanted him to succeed, but repeated disappointments made it increasingly difficult to trust him. Several people close to Williams later admitted that working with him during his final years was both inspiring and exhausting. The situation eventually became so serious that the Grand Ole Opry, the most prestigious institution in country music, dismissed Williams from its roster. His repeated absences, missed performances, and inability to meet professional expectations left Opry officials with little choice. Losing his place at the Opry was a devastating blow and demonstrated how far his problems had progressed. Even one of the biggest stars in America could not escape the consequences of consistently unreliable behavior. What makes Hank Williams such a tragic figure is the contrast between his extraordinary talent and his personal decline. Few artists have ever possessed his ability to connect emotionally with listeners. Yet the same man who could write songs of incredible beauty often created chaos for those around him. His colleagues never doubted his genius. They struggled with the unpredictability that came with it. When Williams died at just 29 years old in 1953, country music lost one of its brightest stars. His legacy remains legendary, but so do the stories of the turmoil that surrounded his final years. Hank Williams was beloved by fans, but for many people who worked beside him, his addictions and unreliability made him one of the most challenging figures country music had ever known. 5. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings is remembered as one of the founding fathers of outlaw country music. With his unmistakable voice, rebellious spirit, and refusal to follow Nashville's rules, he became a symbol of artistic freedom for an entire generation of country fans. Hits like Luckin' Back Texas, Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys, and Good-Hearted Woman made him a superstar. To millions of listeners, Jennings represented independence, authenticity, and strength. But behind the legendary image was a man whose personal struggles often made him extremely difficult for colleagues, managers, and even close friends to deal with. During the peak of his career in the 1970s, Jennings developed a reputation for living the outlaw lifestyle both on and off the stage. Heavy drinking, drug use, and constant touring became part of his daily routine. Unlike many artists who tried to hide these habits, Waylon openly embraced them. The image helped build his legend, but it also created serious problems. As cocaine use became increasingly common in his life, his behavior grew more unpredictable, and people around him often found themselves dealing with the consequences. Many musicians who worked with Jennings admired him deeply, but also described him as stubborn and fiercely resistant to authority. He disliked being told what to do and frequently clashed with record executives, producers, and managers. While his determination helped him gain creative control over his music, it sometimes turned routine business discussions into heated confrontations. Industry insiders learned that convincing Waylon to change his mind was nearly impossible once he had made a decision. His addiction issues made matters even more complicated. During certain periods of his career, cocaine consumed enormous amounts of his time, energy, and money. Friends later recalled that his lifestyle became increasingly chaotic. Recording sessions could become difficult, schedules were harder to maintain, and tensions sometimes emerged within his professional circle. People who worked closely with him often felt torn between admiration for his talent and frustration with the instability that surrounded him. Despite these problems, Jennings remained fiercely loyal to those he trusted. Many colleagues described him as generous, protective, and supportive when relationships were strong. Yet if he felt betrayed or pressured, his response could be swift and unforgiving. His temper, combined with his stubborn nature, occasionally created rifts that lasted for years. Some people found him warm and approachable, while others considered him intimidating and impossible to work with. What makes Waylon Jennings such a fascinating figure is that many of the qualities that caused conflict were the same qualities that made him a legend. His refusal to compromise helped transform country music and inspired countless artists to fight for creative freedom. Without that stubbornness, the outlaw movement might never have become what it was. But for the people trying to manage his career, organize tours, or keep business operations running smoothly, that same stubbornness could be exhausting. In later years, Jennings openly acknowledged the mistakes he made and worked hard to overcome many of his addictions. He eventually regained stability and earned even greater respect within the industry. Nevertheless, stories from his wild outlaw years remain a major part of his legacy. Waylon Jennings was admired for his independence, but that independence often came with a difficult side that many people around him struggled to handle. 6. Tanya Tucker. Tanya Tucker. Tanya Tucker was one of the most remarkable success stories in country music history. She became a star while still a teenager, stunning audiences with a powerful voice and a confidence far beyond her years. Hits like Delta Dawn turned her into a sensation almost overnight, and many believed she was destined to become the future queen of country music. Fans admired her bold personality, fearless attitude, and refusal to conform to traditional expectations. Yet behind the fame was a rebellious streak that often created tension with managers, promoters, record executives, and even some fellow artists. Growing up in the spotlight came with enormous pressure. Unlike many performers who entered the industry as adults, Tucker spent her formative years under constant public scrutiny. As she moved into adulthood, she developed a reputation for partying hard and living life on her own terms. While some fans viewed her behavior as refreshing and independent, others within the industry found it increasingly difficult to manage. Her unwillingness to follow expectations frequently put her at odds with the conservative image country music often tried to maintain. During the late 1970s and 1980s, Tucker became almost as famous for her personal life as for her music. Her highly publicized relationships, late-night partying, and rebellious image generated endless headlines. Record executives often worried that the controversies surrounding her would overshadow her talent. Managers struggled to protect her career while dealing with constant media attention. Some people who worked closely with her admired her honesty and refusal to be controlled, while others saw her as unpredictable and unnecessarily confrontational. One of the most challenging aspects of Tucker's reputation was her resistance to authority. She rarely appeared interested in pleasing executives, publicists, or industry gatekeepers. If she disagreed with someone, she often made her feelings known. This independence helped her avoid becoming another manufactured Nashville star, but it also created professional conflicts. People who expected compliance frequently discovered that Tucker had no intention of changing her behavior simply to make others comfortable. Her personal relationships sometimes reflected the same pattern. Friends and colleagues often described her as passionate, outspoken, and emotionally intense. Those qualities could make her exciting to be around, but they could also lead to arguments and strained relationships. Several people who knew her admitted that life around Tanya Tucker was rarely boring. She possessed a larger-than-life personality that could either attract people or push them away, depending on the situation. What made Tucker particularly frustrating for some industry insiders was that her talent was never in question. Even critics acknowledged her extraordinary vocal ability. She repeatedly demonstrated that she could overcome setbacks and return to the top of the charts. Many executives believed that if she had been more willing to follow the rules, her career might have been even bigger. Tucker, however, seemed more interested in being herself than in meeting anyone else's expectations. Over time, she matured, rebuilt parts of her reputation, and earned renewed respect from both fans and fellow artists. Yet the stories from her rebellious years remain an important chapter of her legacy. Tanya Tucker was never difficult because she lacked talent or professionalism. She was difficult because she refused to let anyone else control her life, and that independence often made her one of the most challenging personalities in country music. 7. Willie Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver was never the most commercially successful star in country music, but among musicians, songwriters, and devoted fans, he earned a reputation as one of the most respected figures in the genre. His songwriting helped shape the outlaw country movement, and artists such as Waylon Jennings built entire albums around his work. Songs like Honky Tonk Heroes showcased his ability to turn hardship, faith, and personal struggle into unforgettable music. To admirers, Shaver was a genuine outlaw who refused to compromise. But to many people who worked with him, that same uncompromising nature could make him incredibly difficult to deal with. Unlike many country stars who carefully managed their public image, Shaver rarely seemed concerned about how others viewed him. He lived according to his own rules and expected everyone around him to accept that reality. Friends often described him as fiercely independent, while critics used words such as stubborn and confrontational. Once Billy Joe made up his mind, convincing him to change course was nearly impossible. Managers, promoters, and record executives frequently discovered that traditional methods of persuasion simply did not work on him. Part of the challenge stemmed from his deep distrust of authority. Having grown up in poverty and endured tremendous hardship throughout his life, Shaver developed a strong belief that he should answer to no one. While that attitude fueled his creativity, it often created tension in professional settings. Business negotiations became difficult because he disliked being pressured. Industry executives who wanted predictable behavior were often frustrated by his refusal to conform to expectations. Even people who admired him sometimes found themselves exhausted by his constant resistance. His unpredictable personality occasionally created problems during tours and live performances. Stories circulated about disagreements, sudden decisions, and conflicts that left organizers scrambling to adapt. Musicians who worked alongside him often respected his talent, but admitted that he could be challenging when disagreements arose. Some described him as deeply loyal to those he trusted, but extremely combative toward anyone he believed was taking advantage of him. This tendency made relationships either very strong or very strained, with little middle ground. The incident that brought the most attention to his volatile reputation occurred in 2007. During an altercation outside a bar in Texas, Shaver shot a man who survived the encounter. Shaver claimed he acted in self-defense, and he was later acquitted. Nevertheless, the case became national news and reinforced his image as a man who lived according to his own code rather than society's expectations. For some fans, the story added to his outlaw legend. For others, it highlighted the dangers of a personality that often seemed drawn toward confrontation. What made Billy Joe Shaver such a complicated figure was that even many people who found him difficult still admired him. His honesty, resilience, and extraordinary songwriting earned widespread respect throughout country music. Few doubted his authenticity. The problem was that authenticity often came with a stubbornness that made collaboration difficult. In the end, Billy Joe Shaver embodied both the strengths and weaknesses of the outlaw country movement. He was fearless, talented, and impossible to control. Those qualities helped make him a legend, but they also made him one of the most challenging personalities many people in country music ever encountered. 8. Jerry Lee Lewis. Although many people remember Jerry Lee Lewis primarily as a rock and roll pioneer, he spent decades as a major force in country music and earned some of the genre's biggest hits. Nicknamed the Killer, Lewis possessed extraordinary talent, unmatched stage presence, and a personality so explosive that he could dominate any room he entered. Songs like What Made Milwaukee Famous, Middle Age Crazy, and She Even Woke Me Up to Say Goodbye helped establish him as a country star long after his rock and roll success. Yet the same personality that made him unforgettable also made him one of the most intimidating and difficult figures in American music. From the beginning of his career, Lewis developed a reputation for arrogance, aggression, and unpredictable behavior. He believed he was the greatest performer on stage, and he rarely hid that opinion. Fellow musicians often recalled how fiercely competitive he could be. If he felt another performer was receiving more attention than he was, tensions frequently followed. Some admired his confidence, while others saw it as an ego that constantly demanded to be the center of attention. His temper became legendary throughout the industry. Stories circulated for decades about arguments, threats, and confrontations involving Lewis. Whether dealing with promoters, reporters, fellow performers, or even fans, he often reacted aggressively when he felt disrespected. People who worked with him learned quickly that minor disagreements could escalate into major conflicts. As a result, many colleagues approached him cautiously, never quite sure how he would respond in a difficult situation. The controversies surrounding his personal life only added to his reputation. Throughout his career, Lewis generated headlines that often overshadowed his music. Public scandals, troubled relationships, legal problems, and reckless behavior repeatedly damaged his public image. While many artists attempted to repair their reputations after controversy, Lewis often seemed unwilling to apologize or change. This refusal to back down became part of his identity and contributed to the perception that he was impossible to control. Even within the country music industry, where larger-than-life personalities were common, Lewis stood apart. Several musicians who admired his talent admitted that working with him could be exhausting. His insistence on getting his way often created friction behind the scenes. Recording sessions, business negotiations, and touring arrangements sometimes became complicated because Lewis rarely accepted compromise. If he believed he was right, he expected everyone else to agree. What made the situation especially frustrating for many people was that his talent justified much of his confidence. Lewis was genuinely one of the most gifted performers of his generation. Audiences were captivated by his energy, and few artists could match his ability to command a stage. This brilliance often caused people to tolerate behavior they would never have accepted from less talented performers. Over the years, Jerry Lee Lewis became almost as famous for his confrontations as for his music. To fans, he was a fearless rebel who refused to bow to public pressure. To many people who worked with him, he was a volatile personality capable of turning a simple disagreement into a major conflict. His career proved that extraordinary talent can open many doors, but it can also allow difficult behavior to continue far longer than it otherwise might. Jerry Lee Lewis left behind a remarkable musical legacy. Yet alongside the hit records and legendary performances remains the reputation of a man whose explosive personality often made him one of the most challenging figures country music ever embraced. 9. Melinda Gail McCready, Mindy McCready. When Mindy McCready arrived on the country music scene in the mid-1990s, she seemed destined for superstardom. Young, talented, and blessed with a powerful voice, she quickly became one of Nashville's brightest new artists. Her debut album produced multiple hit singles, and industry insiders predicted a long and successful career. Fans were drawn to her charm, beauty, and emotional performances. But behind the promising image was a woman struggling with personal issues that would eventually overshadow her music and make life increasingly difficult for the people trying to help her. Unlike many artists on this list, McCready was not known for arrogance or hostility. In fact, many people described her as kind, warm, and deeply sensitive. The challenge came from her instability and the personal crises that seemed to follow her throughout much of her adult life. Managers, record executives, publicists, and close friends often found themselves dealing with emergencies that went far beyond the normal responsibilities of working with an artist. As her career progressed, McCready became involved in a series of highly publicized personal controversies. Legal troubles, relationship problems, custody battles, and substance abuse issues frequently dominated headlines. Each new incident created additional pressure on the people around her. Industry professionals who genuinely wanted to support her often found themselves exhausted by the constant cycle of crises. Some attempted interventions, while others tried to protect her career from the growing negative publicity. One of the most frustrating aspects for those around McCready was the enormous gap between her potential and her reality. Many believed she possessed the talent necessary to become one of country music's biggest stars. Yet repeated personal setbacks prevented her from fully realizing that promise. Record labels invested heavily in her success, only to see opportunities disappear as personal struggles took priority over professional commitments. Colleagues frequently expressed sadness rather than anger because they recognized how much talent was being lost. Her emotional vulnerability also created challenges in professional relationships. Friends and associates often felt responsible for her well-being, which placed significant stress on those closest to her. Many people spent years trying to help her navigate difficult circumstances. Unfortunately, the problems often became larger than any single person could solve. As a result, relationships were strained not because of conflict, but because of the emotional weight carried by everyone involved. The media attention surrounding her life only intensified the situation. Every setback became national news, making recovery even more difficult. Public scrutiny amplified her personal struggles and created additional obstacles for those trying to manage her career. Many industry insiders later reflected on how difficult it was to watch such a talented performer repeatedly battle issues that seemed beyond her control. What makes Mindy McCready's story different from many others is that her reputation for being difficult was rooted less in attitude and more in tragedy. People were not frustrated because she treated others poorly. They were frustrated because they cared about her and felt powerless to stop her decline. The challenges she created were often unintended consequences of deeper personal struggles. By the time her life ended tragically in 2013, many in country music viewed her story as one of the saddest cautionary tales in the industry. Mindy McCready was loved by many who knew her, but the constant turmoil surrounding her life made working with her emotionally exhausting for those who desperately wanted to see her succeed. 10. Randall Hank Williams Jr. Hank Williams Jr. Hank Williams Jr. entered country music carrying one of the heaviest burdens imaginable, being the son of Hank Williams. From childhood, he was expected to follow in the footsteps of a legend. For years, the industry treated him as a continuation of his father's legacy rather than as his own artist. Eventually, he broke free from those expectations and built a hugely successful career of his own. With hits like Family Tradition, A Country Boy Can Survive, and All My Rowdy Friends Are Coming Over Tonight, he became one of the most recognizable stars in country music. But alongside his success came a reputation for being stubborn, confrontational, and extremely difficult to challenge. Throughout his career, Williams developed a strong sense of independence that often bordered on defiance. He rarely softened his opinions to make others comfortable and showed little interest in pleasing critics or industry executives. While fans admired his honesty, many people inside the music business found his attitude challenging. Managers, promoters, and record executives frequently discovered that Hank Jr. preferred to make his own decisions regardless of outside advice. His larger-than-life personality often created tension. Williams never hesitated to speak his mind, whether discussing politics, the music industry, or fellow celebrities. As a result, he occasionally found himself at the center of public controversies that damaged professional relationships. Some colleagues respected his willingness to stand by his beliefs. Others felt he unnecessarily created conflicts that could have been avoided. Either way, few people considered him easy to influence once he had formed an opinion. Williams also inherited some of the rebellious tendencies associated with the outlaw country movement. During certain periods of his life, heavy drinking and hard living contributed to an image of unpredictability. Although he remained highly professional compared to many troubled stars, those around him understood that his temper could emerge quickly when he felt disrespected. Several people who worked with him described him as fiercely loyal to friends, but equally unforgiving toward perceived enemies. One reason Williams earned a reputation as a difficult personality was his refusal to separate personal convictions from professional opportunities. In an industry where diplomacy is often valued, Hank Jr. frequently chose confrontation instead. This approach occasionally led to public disputes that affected business relationships. Some executives viewed him as a risk because they could never be entirely certain what he might say during interviews or public appearances. Yet many of the same qualities that created conflict also helped make him successful. His confidence allowed him to escape the shadow of his father and establish his own identity. His willingness to challenge authority resonated with fans who valued authenticity over polish. Unlike many artists who carefully crafted a public image, Williams projected exactly who he believed himself to be, whether audiences approved or not. People who knew him often described two very different sides of his personality. On one hand, he could be generous, humorous, and deeply loyal. On the other, he could be stubborn, confrontational, and nearly impossible to persuade. Which version people encountered often depended on the circumstances. In the end, Hank Williams Jr. became one of country music's most influential figures, not because he followed the rules, but because he ignored them. That independence earned him millions of fans, but it also contributed to a reputation as one of the most challenging personalities many industry insiders ever had to work with. 11. John R. Cash, Johnny Cash. Few names in country music carry as much respect as Johnny Cash. Known around the world as the Man in Black, he became one of the most influential artists in American music history. His deep voice, powerful storytelling, and image as a champion of the underdog made him beloved by millions. Songs like Ring of Fire, Folsom Prison Blues, and I Walk the Line transformed him into a cultural icon whose legacy extends far beyond country music. Yet despite his reputation as a man of integrity and compassion, there were periods of his life when working with Johnny Cash could be extraordinarily difficult. Much of the trouble stemmed from his long battle with addiction. During the 1960s, Cash became heavily dependent on amphetamines and barbiturates. As his substance abuse worsened, so did his reliability. Concert promoters, producers, and fellow musicians frequently found themselves dealing with missed commitments, erratic behavior, and unpredictable decisions. Some shows suffered because Cash was not physically or mentally prepared to perform at his best. Those who admired him most often became the people most frustrated by his inability to control his addictions. Cash's fame sometimes amplified these problems. Because he was one of the biggest stars in the world, many people were reluctant to confront him directly. This allowed destructive habits to continue longer than they might have for a less successful artist. Friends and colleagues often found themselves covering for him, making excuses, or attempting to manage situations behind the scenes. Several people later admitted that they spent years worrying about whether Cash would destroy his career entirely. His stubborn personality also contributed to professional conflicts. Cash believed strongly in following his own instincts, even when advisors recommended a different course. This independence helped him create some of the most important music of his career, but it occasionally created tension with record executives and producers. He resisted being controlled and frequently challenged authority figures who tried to shape his artistic direction. While fans celebrated this rebellious streak, it could make business relationships difficult. One of the lesser-known aspects of Cash's personality was his tendency toward impulsive behavior during his darkest years. Stories emerged about reckless decisions, damaged relationships, and moments when his actions placed enormous stress on those closest to him. Family members, bandmates, and friends often found themselves trying to help a man they loved while simultaneously coping with the chaos his addictions created. The emotional toll on those around him was significant. What makes Johnny Cash's story especially compelling is that he eventually confronted many of these problems and worked to rebuild his life. Unlike some stars who never escaped their destructive patterns, Cash openly acknowledged his mistakes and fought to overcome them. His later years were marked by greater stability, spiritual reflection, and renewed artistic success. Many people who knew him believed the hardships he endured ultimately made him a wiser and more compassionate person. Still, the struggles of his earlier years cannot be ignored. During those periods, Cash's talent and charisma often existed alongside behavior that frustrated colleagues and worried loved ones. He was not difficult because he lacked kindness. He was difficult because addiction repeatedly placed him and everyone around him in impossible situations. Johnny Cash remains one of country music's greatest legends. But behind the inspiring image was a complicated man whose personal battles sometimes made him one of the most challenging stars in the industry to work with. 12. Merle Haggard. Merle Haggard is widely regarded as one of the greatest artists country music has ever produced. With classics such as Okie from Muskogee, Mama Tried, and The Fight Inside of Me, he became the voice of working-class America and helped define traditional country music for generations. His songwriting was deeply personal, his voice instantly recognizable, and his influence enormous. To fans, Haggard represented authenticity, resilience, and honesty. But behind the legendary career was a man whose strong opinions, stubborn nature, and unpredictable temperament often made him difficult for colleagues and industry professionals to handle. Unlike many stars whose reputations were damaged by addiction or scandal, Haggard's challenges often stemmed from his personality. He was fiercely independent and rarely interested in pleasing people simply to maintain professional harmony. Throughout his career, he developed a reputation for speaking his mind, even when doing so created controversy. Managers, journalists, and fellow musicians frequently discovered that Merle Haggard was not the type of person who would soften his views to avoid conflict. His background played a major role in shaping that attitude. Having spent part of his youth in prison before becoming a star, Haggard developed a deep distrust of authority and a strong belief in self-reliance. Those qualities helped fuel his songwriting and gave his music an authenticity that fans loved. However, they also made collaboration difficult at times. Record executives who attempted to influence his creative decisions often met resistance. Haggard believed he knew what was best for his music, and he rarely welcomed interference. Colleagues frequently described him as a complex personality. On some days, he could be generous, thoughtful, and supportive. On others, he could be distant, moody, and confrontational. Several musicians who worked with him admitted that they never quite knew which version of Merle they would encounter. This unpredictability occasionally created tension during tours, recording sessions, and business negotiations. People respected him immensely, but they also understood that he could be difficult when challenged. His outspoken nature also generated controversy throughout his career. Haggard never hesitated to discuss politics, social issues, or subjects that many entertainers preferred to avoid. While fans often appreciated his honesty, others felt his comments unnecessarily divided audiences. Some industry insiders believed his willingness to voice strong opinions occasionally harmed professional relationships. Yet Haggard showed little interest in changing his behavior to satisfy critics. What made these challenges particularly frustrating for some people was the fact that Haggard's talent was beyond dispute. Even those who disagreed with him often admitted that he was one of the finest songwriters and performers in country music history. His success gave him the freedom to ignore expectations that many other artists would have been forced to follow. As a result, his stubbornness often became both his greatest strength and his greatest challenge. In the end, Merle Haggard remained true to himself throughout his life. He never tried to be the easiest person to work with, nor did he seem especially concerned about winning universal approval. That independence earned him immense respect from fans, but occasionally created headaches for the people around him. Merle Haggard's legacy is built on extraordinary music, uncompromising honesty, and a determination to live by his own rules. Those qualities made him a legend. They also made him one of the most formidable personalities country music ever produced.